Hey everybody, and today for the Harry Potter series we're revisiting Chamber of Secrets, but this time on the PS1. Now I was really surprised to see that there was a PlayStation version since, it was 2002 and the PS2 existed. This version was developed by the same team that worked on the PlayStation version of Sorcerer's Stone, and therefore there are a bunch of similarities. Overall, I liked Sorcerer's Stone on PS1 even with some of the shortcomings. I still felt it was a decent start for the series to build upon. That being said, I wasn't really sure what to expect from Chamber of Secrets on the PlayStation. Like, would the developers just copy and paste everything from the first game and use all of the existing assets and mechanics? Considering the PS1 was on its way out at the time, and clearly EA was putting more of the focus onto the next-gen versions, I always assumed that this version would just be Sorcerer's Stone all over again. However, only about 10 minutes into Chamber of Secrets, and I found myself pleasantly surprised. Chamber is not just a copy and paste version of Sorcerer's Stone. The developers made enhancements, and there's actually more depth here than what was seen in Sorcerer's Stone. They built off that foundation and made several prominent additions, creating a very enjoyable version of Chamber of Secrets that can hold up its own, even against the next-gen versions. Also, can I say what a crappy review I did of this game the first time? I was legit rereading and watching the video after I got the footage back again, and I'm like, god damn, I skipped over so much and I barely said anything. I legit only said that it was like Sorcerer's Stone, and I didn't bother to go into any detail. So I'm kinda glad I chose to redo this series. In regards to the narrative, I have to say that this version is actually more complete than what was seen in the next-gen versions. And that's mainly because this version follows the book rather than the film. Though honestly, the film did cover most of the major events, so there wasn't a ton left out for the game to use in that regard. You see this almost immediately as the first level has you dealing with the ghoul in the attic at the burrow. In fact, you spend more time at the burrow in this version than you did in the next-gen ones. Though there's no Diagon Alley in this section. Instead, you end up heading back there later in the game to look for ingredients for the Polyjuice Potion, which is actually a pretty cool way to handle that. They also included the scene where Malfoy calls Hermione a mudblood, unlike the consoles where it happened off-screen while I was playing Quidditch. And then that scene leads into the next part where Ron spits up slugs, yet another thing that was axed out of the next-gen ones. Hell, they even have the scene where Lockhart sends out the Cupids on Valentine's Day and the Death Day party for Nearly Headless Nick, scenes that weren't even in the film. Many of the characters that were strangely missing on the next-gen versions are also featured here. Dobby is here, so is Mr. Weasley, Colin Creevey, and even Lockhart gets more screen time than he did in the other versions. They don't explain that he's a fraud here either, but he does follow Harry and Ron into the Chamber of Secrets, which is better than how he just, disappeared halfway through the game in the other versions. Another positive addition here is how the game handled the Chamber of Secrets itself. I was particularly disappointed that in the other versions of the game, Harry just jumps down and he's automatically in there. In this version, there are puzzle rooms before the entrance, and these rooms have you using all of the spells and platforming abilities to get through them. In addition to that, there are actually several playable sections here in the PS1 version that were only cutscenes in the other versions of the game. You get to control Harry during the Floo-Patter sequence, and the trip down into the Chamber of Secrets. You'll fly the Fort Angula to Hogwarts, which is actually something I always wanted to do in the other versions of the game, and there's even a scene depicting the Rogue Bludger as it chases Harry during the Quidditch match. Overall, I liked the additions from the book being here, as well as more of the content from the film. If I could somehow merge the plot points depicted in this game with what was on console, I think I could create the best adaptation of Chamber. Cause now that I'm thinking about it, I think this version has almost every scene in the movie either playable or represented in a cutscene. Chamber of Secrets on the PlayStation understands the one thing that most movie games don't bother understanding, that the goal is to take the movie's plot and make a fun experience around it. That means looking at each scene and asking, how can you make that a level in the game? This version's developer definitely asked that question more than the next-gen developers did, since something as simple as the ghoul or Floo-Patter sequence either gets cut or placed into a cutscene in the next-generation versions, but here it gets turned into a small, playable little mini-game. I'm not praising this type of design as sensational or anything, it just shows the effort on the developer's parts in this instance. Now, as I mentioned, Chamber of Secrets makes some improvements over the gameplay of Sorcerer's Stone on the PlayStation. First, though, I have to mention it here because I'm not really sure where I could have later on, but the game features autosaving. Autosaving on a PlayStation 1 game. Sounds very strange. Like, the PS1 was defined by memory cards and save points and all that stuff, and yet here's a game literally doing something that wouldn't be commonplace until almost 2 more whole console generations. Heck, even the next-gen versions on the Xbox, PS2, and GameCube, you still have to go to a save point. Just had to mention this here because I was amazed that this was a feature at all. Now, back to the gameplay. You still have to go to class to learn spells, and you still have to do the follow the pointer thingy like the first game. However, this time you're graded based on your performance, which is affected by your timing of the correct buttons. The timing can be a bit hard to get right, so it's a challenge to try and get an A+. Like, seriously, I can't tell if you have to press it before it hits, or as it hits, or when the chime noise happens, though thankfully you can replay these classes afterwards to try again, so you're not completely locked out after one attempt. Sadly, however, there are only 2 classes, and one weird random lesson with Lockhart. After learning each spell, you get to try it out in a challenge area. These areas are not as extensive as what was seen in the other versions of Chamber of Secrets, but they are slightly better than what was done in Sorcerer's Stone, because you got the spell, went into a room, did one thing with it, and then left. At least here there's, something a little bit more substantial. Also, there's no more time-wasting minigames to cast spells. Back in my original Sorcerer's Stone review, I mentioned that objects should just sparkle a certain color, and then you should be able to use that spell. And that's pretty much the system that's used here. Thanks to this more simplistic spell system, you get to use your spells more often throughout the game, rather than just in certain areas. The downside here is that there's only one new spell to learn, the rest repeat from Sorcerer's Stone. You start the game with Flipendo and Wingardium Leviosa, which makes sense because we learned them in the last game, but then you relearn Incendio and Verdimillious, which both function the same way. Incendio still burns plants, though now it can hurt certain enemies, and Verdimillious still lights up invisible platforms, but now it can also show hidden entrances. The new spell here is Petrificus Totalis, which you only use in one area with the Pixies, and I don't think it was ever used again. Avifor's was completely cut, and I'm not really sure why. Also questionable is that there's no Charms class or Transfiguration class in the game, which definitely could have helped bulk out that spell list. A new feature to the game are the Wizard Duels. These were featured in the next-gen versions too, but they were slightly streamlined there. In the next-gen console versions, you basically engage your opponent in a tennis match, flicking Flipendo back and forth between each other. Here the system's pretty fun. You get to spam Flipendo to try and hit your opponent, and you can charge it up for a more powerful attack that takes more damage. There's also special power-ups that you can use to make your spell charge faster, launch multiple spells at once, or get a more powerful spell overall, without having to charge it. You collect these power-ups by letting your opponent hit objects on your side of the field. The flip side is that you can do the same thing, so this kind of makes you want to watch where you're firing spells. The power-ups aren't necessary to win by any means, but it's a nice addition to spice up what could have just been very, generic firing spell duels. The game also has special Founders Duels. Each Hogwarts house has a student representing the best duelist, and if you win, you get the Wizard card for the house's founder. Beating all of them unlocks Founder's Tower, which allows you to see concept art from the game. It's not the best reward to be sure, but it's something at least. These duels are fun, since the game doesn't throw 100 of them at you like what will eventually happen in the Half-Blood Prince game. And while also bringing up the Half-Blood Prince game, this dueling system isn't nearly as broken as to what was seen in that game, and thus is way, way more enjoyable. There are a few boss fights, but they're nothing to write home about. The most interesting one has to be the one against Peeves at the Death Day party. Here you have to Flipendo the objects he throws at you before they hit you, but there's a small window to hit Peeves after he throws the last objects. If you're too slow, he becomes invisible again, and so you have to take advantage of when he throws an object and then take your shot. It's not as simple as just letting him throw 3 things and then take your free hit. The boss fight against Aragog is very weak. Calling him a boss fight just seems like a step too far. Unlike in the next-gen versions where you had to burn the webs and then attack Aragog head-on, you don't actually fight him here. Instead, he's standing on a web connected to 4 trees. The goal here is to Flipendo the trees over and over until each one of their health bars drains. The only thing to avoid here are the few spiders running around the area, and honestly, it's super easy just to circle over and over again and keep hitting the trees. Aragog doesn't even attempt to do anything unless you kill all of the spiders that he sends out. And even then, he just charges ahead and then doubles back and sends out more spiders. After completing this, he ran off into a tunnel, and I thought, okay, there's a second phase. But nope, you go through the tunnel and escape the forest. The fight against the Basilisk is more interesting, but it kind of drags. The first phase is ridiculously easy. You just move around, dodging Spit, hitting him with Flipendo, and it takes huge chunks off his health bar. The second part isn't really engaging and sort of kind of works on autopilot. At this point, you get the Sword of Gryffindor, and you have to press the X button to reflect these weird laser beams back at the Basilisk. However, as soon as you press X, you'll automatically get into the reflecting stance, and the beam bounces off. You don't have to time it or anything, you just hold X and you're gold. What drags a bit here is that the beams have to be moved into the Basilisk's face, but controlling it can be tough, and you take very little off the health bar. Way less than what you were doing with the Flipendo spell a moment ago. So it takes several attempts at doing this, and it just drags on to the point where it became boring. Honestly, it wasn't much better than the next-gen fight, to be honest, though I guess that was more annoying because the sword kept flying out of Harry's hand and you had to go get it. At least here you never lose the sword. There are also a bunch of little mini-games that pop up as you play, like throwing gnomes, the flue powder slide, stunning pixies, catching Ron slugs that he vomits, racing a Slytherin through the dungeons to reach the common room. They even reuse the troll chase scene from Sorcerer's Stone for the Cupid chase. These are short and simple, but it keeps the game from getting stale or dragging and getting predictable. And with only those 2 classes and the short challenge chambers, there definitely needed to be something to keep the game's momentum going. There are other side quests to take part in, like playing Quidditch and collecting wizard cards. Finding the cards is actually more intensive than it was in the last game. In Sorcerer's Stone, you would just enter a secret passageway and collect the card no problem. In Chamber of Secrets, you still use the secret passages, but the rooms are way more expansive, and sometimes you need to use certain spells to make progress to get the card. So these are like small little challenge areas, and honestly it's exciting to see what setup will be behind each secret passage. Quidditch works like it did in the first game, which is by no means a bad thing. I mentioned the Quidditch match in the story where the rogue bludger chases you, but that plays out more like the chase against Malfoy from Sorcerer's Stone. To play Quidditch normally, you have to do it from the main menu. Here it's played just like how it was in the first game with no big changes. Again, like I said, that's not a bad thing, as Quidditch was fun enough in Sorcerer's Stone. The one tweak they did make was in regards to catching the snitch. You still have a timer to catch it, but this time you get a 3D hand model, and you have to move it around and wait for the right time to grab it. You also collect beans again, although this time they're not divided by color, you just collect them all together. You mostly use them to buy wizard cards from Fred and George, though once you buy all 5 cards from them, the only thing left to use them for is to collect 500, and then you'll get the Flipendo upgrade from the first game. You can also replay missions from the common room, and this is a nice way of collecting the cards you missed, or redoing classes to get better grades, redoing the races to classes, which also results in an in-game trophy. However, you can't replay all of the levels from the game, just the ones connected to missable content like the cards. So unfortunately, it's mostly the pre-Hogwarts missions that are selectable from this book. The presentation is pretty much what was seen in Sorcerer's Stone. The game retains the storybook narration, though the art style used previously has been replaced. The storybook now uses the character models from the next-gen versions in still images. Sometimes this looks okay, though other times the images look a bit crude. On the side note, these sections are now narrated by Jim Dale, who narrated the US version of the Potter audiobooks. Character models look the same, which is to be expected since not only is this another late PS1 release, but this game had a turnaround of a year. The areas around Hogwarts are a bit larger and more in line with areas from the film, although many of the areas that return from the first game have been redesigned rather than just simply being reused. In fact, aside from I think the entrance hall, Great Hall, and the Quidditch pitch, every other location in the castle is different from the first game. The music is a nice mix of Jeremy Soul's work from the first game and the second, and it sounds amazing. There's a few tracks that are original to this version, and they sound just in line with Soul's work on Sorcerer's Stone. I will say though, it is a tad strange to hear the soundtrack that I usually associate with the next-gen versions of Chamber of Secrets coming out of this one. Overall, I have to say that I was very impressed with Chamber of Secrets. I was a bit hesitant to try it since I assumed it was going to be more of what I saw in Sorcerer's Stone. Thankfully, the developers made changes and tried to improve upon the foundation of the first game. I still kinda prefer the Xbox version, mostly due to the bigger challenge areas and the free roam flying, but the PS1 version holds up very well, and it's actually the most accurate to the book and film's plot. What I liked most about this version was the variety to the base gameplay. It's not just about going to class and moving on to the next one. The random minigames that pop up keep the gameplay fresh, and it makes you interested to see what the game's gonna do next. Also, I was very happy that they didn't just reuse everything from the first game. The troll chase being reused as the gnome chase is about as blatant as it gets. If you really enjoyed Sorcerer's Stone, you should give this one a try, as it definitely is the better of the 2 PlayStation Potter games. So come back next time as the Harry Potter review series continues. Thanks for watching.